The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone corridors of Windsor Castle as Princess and made her way toward the Privy Council chamber. Her footsteps echoed with the confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating the intricate pathways of royal duty. At 73, and remained the embodiment of unwavering dedication to the crown, her reputation as the hardest-working royal firmly established through countless charitable engagements and public duties. The Princess Royal had received the summons the previous evening, a formal request to attend an emergency session of the Privy Council. Such meetings were rare, typically reserved for matters of constitutional significance or urgent state business, and assumed it concerned the ongoing discussions about streamlining the monarchy, a topic that had dominated private conversations within the royal family for months. Queen Camilla had been instrumental in these modernization efforts since Charles ascended to the throne. Her influence over the king had grown considerably, extending far beyond the ceremonial role traditionally expected of a consort. Palace staff had noticed the shift gradually, how Charles increasingly deferred to Camilla's judgment on matters both public and private. What had once been gentle suggestions had evolved into decisive input on everything from state visit protocols to family dynamics. The relationship between and Camilla had always been cordial but distant, and fiercely protective of royal traditions and her late mother's legacy, often found herself at odds with Camilla's more progressive approach to monarchy. Where and valued duty above all else, Camilla seemed to prioritize public perception and media relations. The Princess Royal had watched with growing concern as various ceremonial roles were reassigned and traditional protocols modified under Camilla's influence. As Anne approached the chamber, she noticed an unusual amount of activity in the corridors. Palace staff moved with hurried efficiency, their expressions tense and focused. Security personnel stood at attention with heightened alertness. Something significant was clearly unfolding, though the nature remained unclear to those outside the inner circle. The heavy oak doors of the Privy Council chamber stood imposing before her, their brass handles polished to mirror brightness, and had passed through these doors countless times throughout her life, first as a young princess accompanying her mother, later as a working royal representing the crown at various ceremonial functions. The chamber itself held decades of constitutional history, its walls witnesses to decisions that had shaped the modern British monarchy. However, as Anne reached for the door handle, a senior palace aide approached with visible discomfort. The man, whom Anne recognized as one of Camilla's closest advisors, cleared his throat nervously before delivering a message that would send shockwaves through the royal establishment. The aide informed Anne that her presence would not be required at the meeting. The decision, he explained, had come directly from Queen Camilla, who felt that the matters to be discussed were better suited to a smaller, more focused group. The explanation felt hollow and rehearsed, lacking the substance Anne would expect for such an unprecedented exclusion. Anne's initial reaction was one of stunned silence. Throughout her entire adult life, she had never been excluded from significant royal business. Even during the most challenging periods of the monarchy's recent history, including the difficult years surrounding her parents' golden jubilee and her mother's passing, and had remained a constant presence in all major decisions. Her exclusion felt not just unexpected, but fundamentally wrong. The aide continued to explain that Queen Camilla had specifically requested that only those directly involved in the immediate succession line participate in the discussions. This reasoning struck Anne as particularly troubling, as it suggested a fundamental shift in how the monarchy viewed its extended working members. The Princess Royal had dedicated her entire life to supporting the institution, often taking on engagements that other royals declined or couldn't manage. Standing in the corridor, and felt the weight of generations of royal service behind her. Her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, had once told her that being royal meant putting duty before personal feelings, accepting decisions made for the greater good of the institution. Yet this felt different, not like a decision made for constitutional necessity, but one driven by personal dynamics and shifting power balances within the family. The conversation that followed was brief, but illuminating. When impressed for more specific information about the meeting's agenda, the aide's responses became increasingly vague. References to modernization initiatives and streamlined decision-making processes suggested that fundamental changes to royal operations were being discussed without input from one of the monarchy's most experienced and dedicated members. Other staff members began to gather in the corridor, their presence creating an awkward tension, and realized that her exclusion was becoming a public spectacle within the palace walls. The very staff who had worked alongside her for decades were witnessing what appeared to be a significant diminishment of her role and influence. The implications extended far beyond personal embarrassment to questions about the future structure of the royal family itself. Word of Anne's exclusion spread quickly through the palace's informal communication networks. Kitchen staff whispered during meal preparation, while housekeeping teams exchanged concerned glances as they went about their duties. The Princess Royal had always been particularly respected by the working staff, known for her direct communication style and genuine appreciation for their contributions. Many had worked at the palace for decades, serving through multiple generations of royals, and had never witnessed such a clear dismissal of a senior family member. The timing of the exclusion seemed particularly significant given recent changes within the royal household. Queen Camilla had been gradually expanding her influence over palace operations, bringing in new advisors and implementing changes to long-standing protocols. Some traditional ceremonies had been modified or eliminated entirely under the banner of modernization. These changes had been met with mixed reactions from both palace staff and the broader royal family, and spent the remainder of the morning in her private apartments, considering the implications of what had occurred. The exclusion wasn't simply about missing one meeting. It represented a fundamental shift in the family dynamics that had governed the monarchy for decades. If senior working royals could be arbitrarily excluded from important discussions, what did that mean for the institution's future stability? The Princess Royal's mind turned to her late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had managed family tensions while maintaining the monarchy's dignity and effectiveness. Elizabeth had possessed a remarkable ability to balance competing interests within the royal family, while ensuring that institutional needs remained paramount. The current situation suggested that such careful balance was being abandoned in favor of a more centralized approach to decision-making. As the day progressed, and began receiving discreet messages from other palace sources, these communications, delivered through trusted intermediaries who had served the royal family for years, painted a troubling picture of the morning's events. The Privy Council meeting had indeed addressed significant changes to royal protocols, including modifications to the order of precedence and adjustments to ceremonial roles during state functions. More concerning were reports that Queen Camilla had used the meeting to propose a formal restructuring of working royal responsibilities. Under these proposed changes, the circle of senior royals involved in constitutional matters would be significantly reduced, effectively concentrating power within a smaller group centered around Charles and Camilla themselves. Traditional roles that had been held by various family members for generations would be consolidated or eliminated entirely. The exclusion began to make more sense within this broader context. Anne's reputation for speaking directly about issues, combined with her deep knowledge of royal traditions, would have made her a formidable opponent to such dramatic changes. By excluding her from the initial discussions, Camilla had ensured that the proposals could be presented as already decided rather than matters open for debate, and also learned that several other senior staff members had raised concerns about the proposed changes during the meeting. Lord Chamberlain had reportedly questioned the constitutional implications of such significant modifications to established protocols. The private secretary to the sovereign had expressed worries about public reception of changes that might be perceived as diminishing the monarchy's traditional character. However, these concerns have been dismissed by Queen Camilla, who argued that modernization was essential for the monarchy's continued relevance. She had presented polling data suggesting that public support was stronger for a more streamlined royal family, though the source and methodology of these surveys remained unclear to those present. The Queen's advisors had supported her position, creating a situation where institutional concerns were overshadowed by modern public relations strategies. The most troubling aspect of the reports and received concerned the speed with which decisions were being implemented, rather than the careful, deliberate process traditionally used for significant changes. Queen Camilla appeared to be pushing through modifications with unusual haste. Several protocols were scheduled to be altered within weeks, giving little time for proper consultation or constitutional review. As evening approached and reflected on the day's events and their broader implications, the exclusion from a chamber represented more than personal slight. It suggested a fundamental transformation in how the monarchy would operate under Charles and Camilla's leadership. The careful balance between tradition and modernization that had characterized Queen Elizabeth's reign appeared to be giving way to a more aggressive reform agenda. The Princess Royal understood that challenging this development would require careful consideration of both constitutional and family dynamics. Direct confrontation might result in further isolation, while passive acceptance could enable changes that undermine the monarchy's long-term stability. The decision about how to respond would need to balance her personal principles with her dedication to the institution she had served faithfully for over 5 decades. The day had begun with and expecting to contribute her experience and wisdom to important royal business. It ended with her facing the possibility that her role within the monarchy might be fundamentally different than she had imagined. The corridors of Windsor Castle, which had always represented stability and continuity, now seemed to echo with uncertainty about the future direction of the royal family. King Charles remained unaware of his sister's exclusion from the chamber, a fact that would prove crucial in the days to come. His absence from the palace that morning, attending to agricultural interests at Highgrove, meant that he had no immediate knowledge of the decisions being made in his name. The gap between the king's intentions and the actions being taken by those around him would soon create complications that none of the participants could have anticipated. The following morning brought an unusual tension to Buckingham Palace as news of Princess Anne's exclusion began to circulate through unofficial channels. Palace staff, accustomed to the careful protocols that governed royal family interactions, found themselves navigating uncharted territory. The kitchen staff whispered over early morning tea preparations, while the housekeeping team exchanged meaningful glances as they went about their duties in the private apartments. Queen Camilla appeared particularly focused on her schedule that day, meeting with a succession of advisors and modernization consultants who had become increasingly prominent figures in palace operations. These individuals, many of whom had backgrounds in public relations and corporate restructuring, represented a new breed of royal advisor. Unlike the traditional courtiers who had served the monarchy for generations, these newcomers brought aggressive strategies typically associated with business transformation rather than constitutional governance. The Queen's primary advisor, a sharp-minded woman named Victoria Hartwell, had earned her reputation managing crisis communications for major corporations facing public relations disasters. Hartwell's approach to royal modernization involved treating the monarchy like any other public-facing organization that needed to adapt to contemporary expectations. Her influence over Queen Camilla had grown significantly since the coronation, and her presence in these crucial discussions represented a fundamental shift in how royal decisions were being made. During their morning briefing, Hartwell presented Camilla with detailed analysis of public sentiment regarding the royal family structure. The data suggested that younger demographics particularly favored a smaller, more efficient monarchy focused on core working royals. These findings were used to justify the previous day's decisions, though several palace insiders questioned the interpretation of complex public opinion through such a narrow lens. Meanwhile, Princess Anne spent her morning reviewing correspondence from various charitable organizations with whom she maintained patronages. The routine task took on new significance as she considered how the proposed changes might affect her ability to fulfill these long-standing commitments. Many of these organizations had relied on royal patronage for decades, using Anne's involvement to raise awareness and funds for crucial social causes. The Princess Royal's reputation for genuine engagement rather than ceremonial appearances had made her particularly valuable to these groups. A phone call from the Lord Lieutenant of Gloucestershire interrupted Ann's correspondence review. The conversation concerned arrangements for an upcoming county event where Anne was scheduled to present awards to local volunteers. As they discussed logistics, Anne found herself wondering whether such engagements would continue under the new structure being implemented by Queen Camilla. The uncertainty added a layer of complexity to even routine planning activities. The Lord Lieutenant, a distinguished gentleman who had served in a role for nearly 2 decades, expressed subtle concerns about recent changes in royal protocol. Without directly criticizing the modernization efforts, he mentioned confusion among local officials about new procedures for royal visits. These comments suggested that the impact of Camilla's reforms was already being felt beyond palace walls, creating uncertainty among the network of officials who facilitated royal engagements throughout the United Kingdom. Back at the palace, King Charles was reviewing briefing materials for an upcoming state visit when his private secretary entered with an unusual request. The secretary, a diplomatic veteran named Sir Geoffrey Morrison, needed clarification on protocol changes that had apparently been decided the previous day. Morrison's confusion was evident as he described modifications to ceremonial procedures that seemed to contradict established traditions without clear justification. Charles expressed surprise at several of the changes, particularly those affecting the roles of senior family members during state functions. His understanding had been that any significant protocol modifications would be discussed with him before implementation. The king's reaction suggested a disconnect between the decisions being made in his name and his actual involvement in the decision-making process. Sir Geoffrey carefully explained that the changes had emerged from a Privy Council session that the king had not attended due to his agricultural commitments at Highgrove. The private secretary's diplomatic language couldn't entirely mask his concern about the pace and scope of modifications being implemented without the monarch's direct participation. Constitutional protocols typically require the sovereign's explicit approval for changes to ceremonial procedures. Yet these alterations appear to have bypassed normal channels. The conversation between Charles and his private secretary revealed a broader pattern of communication gaps within the royal household. While Queen Camilla's advisors were implementing aggressive modernization strategies, traditional palace officials found themselves struggling to understand how these changes aligned with constitutional requirements and long-standing royal traditions. The speed of implementation left little time for the careful consultation process typically associated with significant protocol modifications. Charles decided to postpone his afternoon appointments to review the full scope of changes that had been approved in his absence. As he examined the documentation, his concern grew about both the substance of the modifications and the process through which they had been implemented. Several changes appeared to concentrate decision-making authority in ways that reduced the traditional checks and balances that had governed royal operations for generations. Particularly troubling to the king were modifications that affected the roles of working royals during constitutional ceremonies. These changes weren't simply about efficiency or modernization. They represented fundamental alterations to the monarchy's structure that could have long-term implications for institutional stability. Charles had always believed that the strength of the British monarchy lay in its careful balance between tradition and adaptation, but these changes seemed to prioritize speed over deliberation. The king's review also revealed that Princess Anne had been excluded from the discussions that produced these modifications. This discovery was particularly concerning given Anne's extensive experience and deep understanding of royal protocols. Her exclusion wasn't simply a matter of family dynamics. It represented the loss of institutional knowledge that had taken decades to develop. Charles began to understand that the modernization process might be moving faster than prudent governance would recommend. Meanwhile, Princess Anne received an unexpected visit from the Duke of Gloucester, one of the Queen's cousins who had maintained a quiet but steady presence in royal duties for decades. Richard, as he was known within the family, brought concerning news about conversations he had overheard among newer palace staff. These employees, many recently hired by Queen Camilla's team, spoke about the royal family with a casual disregard for traditional protocols that troubled the older generation of royals. The Duke shared his observations about the changing atmosphere within palace walls. Longtime staff members appeared increasingly uncertain about their roles and responsibilities as new management approaches were implemented. Some veteran employees had been reassigned to different departments without clear explanation, while others found their traditional duties modified or eliminated entirely. The institutional knowledge represented by these experienced workers was being disrupted in ways that could affect the monarchy's operational effectiveness. Richard also mentioned conversations with other senior royals who had begun to question the direction of recent changes. While none wanted to create public controversy, there was growing private concern about the concentration of influence around Queen Camilla and her advisors. The traditional system of distributed responsibility among working royals was being replaced by a more centralized approach that some viewed as potentially unstable. These conversations highlighted the broader implications of Anne's exclusion from the Privy Council chamber. Rather than an isolated incident, it represented part of a systematic restructuring that was affecting multiple aspects of royal operations. The changes went beyond protocol modifications to include fundamental alterations in how the monarchy related to Parliament, the military, and various civic institutions throughout the Commonwealth. Princess Anne spent considerable time that afternoon consulting with constitutional experts who had advised the royal family for years. These scholars, while careful to avoid direct criticism of current policies, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of change and its potential impact on the monarchy's constitutional role. Several mentioned that similar rapid transformations in other constitutional monarchies had created unexpected complications that took years to resolve. The experts particularly worried about changes that might affect the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and the judiciary. The British constitutional system relied on careful balances between institutions that had evolved over centuries. Rapid modifications to royal protocols could create unintended consequences that might not become apparent until constitutional crises arose. The importance of maintaining traditional consultative processes was emphasized as crucial for preserving institutional stability. As evening approached, King Charles found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His review of the previous day's decisions had revealed changes that he had not anticipated and protocols that seemed to contradict his understanding of constitutional requirements. The king faced the delicate challenge of addressing these concerns without creating a public crisis that could damage the monarchy's reputation. The situation was complicated by his personal relationship with Queen Camilla and his desire to support her modernization efforts. Charles had genuinely believed that updating royal protocols was necessary for the monarchy's continued relevance. But the implementation process had apparently moved beyond his expectations. The challenge now was finding a way to slow down or modify the changes without appearing to undermine his wife's authority or creating internal family conflict. Charles decided to schedule a private meeting with Queen Camilla for the following morning, though he was uncertain how to approach the conversation. The discussion would need to address both constitutional concerns and family dynamics while preserving the united front that was essential for royal effectiveness. The king understood that any public perception of disagreement between himself and Camilla could create opportunities for Republican critics to question the monarchy's stability. The day concluded with various members of the royal household struggling to understand their new roles and responsibilities under the modified protocols. Palace operations continued, but with an underlying tension that reflected uncertainty about the future direction of royal governance. The careful balance between tradition and modernization that had characterized the monarchy for generations was being tested in ways that would have significant implications for the institution's long-term stability and effectiveness. The scheduled morning meeting between King Charles and Queen Camilla took place in the king's private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and family photographs that had witnessed countless important conversations throughout the reign of his mother. Charles had spent considerable time the previous evening preparing for this discussion, understanding that how he approached the topic would significantly impact both their personal relationship and the monarchy's future direction. Camilla arrived precisely on time, accompanied by Victoria Hartwell, her primary advisor on modernization initiatives. The presence of Hartwell immediately signaled that this would be more than a casual conversation between spouses. It represented a formal discussion about palace policy and constitutional matters. Charles had expected a private conversation, but he adapted to the situation while noting the implications of having outside advisors present for such sensitive discussions. The king began by expressing his support for modernization efforts while raising concerns about the pace and scope of recent changes. His diplomatic approach reflected years of experience navigating complex political situations, but it also revealed his genuine struggle to balance institutional needs with family harmony. Charles emphasized his desire to understand the full implications of protocol modifications before they were implemented, particularly those affecting constitutional ceremonies and the roles of senior family members. Queen Camilla's response revealed the depth of her commitment to the modernization agenda and her belief that rapid change was essential for the monarchy's survival. She presented detailed polling data and public opinion research that suggested strong support for a more efficient royal family structure. Her arguments were well prepared and professionally presented, reflecting the influence of her advisory team in shaping both the substance and presentation of her position. Hartwell contributed analysis that framed the changes as necessary responses to contemporary public expectations and media scrutiny. The advisor's corporate background was evident in her approach to royal reform, treating the monarchy as an organization that needed to adapt quickly to changing market conditions. This perspective, while potentially valuable, represented a fundamental shift from the traditional view of the monarchy as a constitutional institution with responsibilities that extended beyond public popularity. During the discussion, Charles raised specific concerns about Princess Anne's exclusion from the Privy Council chamber. He emphasized his sister's decades of loyal service and her extensive knowledge of royal protocols, questioning why such experience would be excluded from important discussions. The king's defense of and wasn't simply about family loyalty. It reflected his understanding of the value of institutional memory and the importance of diverse perspectives in decision-making processes. Camilla's explanation for Anne's exclusion focused on efficiency and the need for streamlined decision-making processes. She argued that including too many participants in policy discussions slowed progress and created unnecessary complications. The Queen also suggested that Anne's traditional approach to royal duties might conflict with innovative solutions required for modern challenges. These arguments revealed underlying tensions between different philosophies of royal governance that had been developing since Charles's accession. The conversation became more heated when Charles questioned the constitutional implications of some protocol changes. His concerns weren't simply about tradition. They reflected genuine worries about potential conflicts with parliamentary procedures and judicial protocols. The king's constitutional law education had taught him to consider the broader implications of royal actions, and several recent changes appear to create potential complications that hadn't been adequately addressed. Hartwell attempted to dismiss these concerns as overly cautious resistance to necessary change, but Charles persisted in seeking detailed explanations for how specific modifications aligned with constitutional requirements. The advisor's corporate background had not included extensive study of British constitutional law, and her responses revealed gaps in understanding about the monarchy's complex relationship with other government institutions. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that fundamental disagreements existed about both the direction and pace of royal modernization. Charles favored careful, deliberate change that preserved essential constitutional functions while adapting to contemporary needs. Camilla and her advisors advocated for rapid transformation that prioritized public perception and media effectiveness over traditional protocols and procedures. The discussion also revealed communication breakdowns within the royal household that had contributed to recent problems. Charles learned that several important decisions had been made through informal consultations that bypassed established advisory channels. Traditional courtiers and constitutional experts who typically participated in policy discussions had been excluded from key conversations, replaced by modernization consultants whose expertise lay in public relations rather than governmental procedures. Queen Camilla expressed frustration with what she characterized as institutional resistance to necessary change. She argued that traditional advisors were too invested in preserving outdated systems to provide objective guidance about contemporary challenges. The Queen's perspective reflected genuine concerns about the monarchy's ability to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world, but her solutions involved abandoning institutional safeguards that had protected the monarchy through previous periods of social transformation. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from Sir Geoffrey Morrison, the King's private secretary, requesting immediate consultation about a constitutional question that had emerged from recent protocol changes. The situation involved potential conflicts between modified royal procedures and parliamentary ceremonies scheduled for the following week. This interruption provided concrete evidence of the practical complications that rapid change could create. Charles used this development to illustrate his broader concerns about implementation speed and consultation processes. He emphasized that constitutional modifications required careful coordination with other government institutions to avoid procedural conflicts that could embarrass the monarchy and complicate governmental operations. The King's practical experience with constitutional matters informed his insistence on thorough review processes before implementing significant changes. Hartwell suggested that such complications were temporary growing pains that would resolve themselves as new procedures became established. Her confidence in this assessment reflected limited understanding of constitutional complexities and the potential for seemingly minor procedural conflicts to create major political complications. Charles's constitutional training had taught him that institutional relationships built over centuries could be damaged by hasty modifications that failed to consider broader implications. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with both sides presenting detailed arguments for their respective positions. Charles emphasized the importance of preserving institutional stability while adapting to contemporary needs, while Camilla argued for bold transformation that demonstrated royal willingness to embrace modern expectations. Neither position was entirely unreasonable, but the differences in approach had significant implications for royal operations and constitutional governance. As the meeting concluded, both Charles and Camilla agreed on the need for better communication processes within the royal household. However, they remained divided about the appropriate pace and scope of ongoing changes. The King requested involvement in future policy discussions, while the Queen sought assurance that traditional resistance wouldn't obstruct necessary modernization efforts. These competing priorities would require ongoing negotiation and compromise. Meanwhile, Princess Anne was dealing with the practical consequences of her exclusion from royal policy discussions. She had received several inquiries from charitable organizations about changes to royal patronage procedures that she couldn't adequately answer. The uncertainty created by rapid policy modifications was affecting her ability to fulfill existing commitments and plan future engagements effectively. The Princess Royal also received a concerning phone call from the Commonwealth Secretary General's office requesting clarification about modified protocols for upcoming Commonwealth events. These ceremonies involved multiple countries and complex diplomatic considerations that required careful coordination. Changes made without adequate consultation could create international complications that extended far beyond domestic royal operations. Anne's extensive experience with Commonwealth relations had taught her the importance of maintaining consistent protocols that facilitated cooperation between member nations. The rapid modifications being implemented by Queen Camilla's team appear to prioritize domestic considerations over international relationships that were crucial for the monarchy's global role. This oversight could have long-term consequences for Britain's soft power and diplomatic effectiveness. The Princess Royal decided to document her concerns in a formal memorandum that could be presented to the King if appropriate. Her analysis focused on practical implications rather than personal grievances, emphasizing the potential international and constitutional complications that rapid change might create. Anne's approach reflected her understanding that institutional concerns should take precedence over family dynamics in addressing these challenges. As the day progressed, news of tensions within the royal household began to leak to media sources through informal palace networks. While no specific details were reported, speculation about internal disagreements created additional pressure on the royal family to present a united front. The situation demonstrated how internal policy disputes could quickly become public relations challenges that complicated both family relationships and institutional effectiveness. The complexity of the situation was further increased by the scheduled state visit from a major Commonwealth nation that would require extensive ceremonial coordination. Traditional protocols for such events involved multiple senior royals and established procedures that had been developed over decades. Recent modifications to these procedures created uncertainty about roles and responsibilities that could affect the success of this important diplomatic occasion. King Charles spent considerable time that evening reviewing constitutional precedents and consulting with legal experts about the implications of recent changes. His research confirmed several concerns about potential conflicts with parliamentary and judicial procedures that hadn't been adequately addressed during the rapid implementation process. The king's findings suggested that some modifications might need to be reversed or significantly altered to avoid constitutional complications. The day concluded with various members of the royal household struggling to understand how new policies would affect their specific responsibilities and relationships. The careful balance between tradition and innovation that had characterized British royal governance for generations was being tested in unprecedented ways, with implications that extended far beyond palace walls to affect Britain's constitutional system and international relationships.